tried my Lord and Master, with no one to defend. Within the halls of Pilate, he stood without a friend.
Written in Greek. Okay, so those were the two dominant languages, Hebrew and Greek. Do we have the autographs today of any of the books that were written? What do we mean by an autograph? Yeah, that original copy. Paul sat down and he actually took a pen and wrote on paper and sent that to a church, and we do not have that original document today. What do we have? Copies, okay? And we have copies, and they are referred to as manuscripts, okay? Manuscripts. Now, how many of you have ever studied in the Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts? I didn't say study about them. I say, how many of you have studied them? Nobody, okay? Nobody. Isn't that amazing? Okay. In order to do that, you would have to know what? Hebrew and Greek. And unfortunately, none of us know Hebrew and Greek. I've taken both and don't like either. They're hard to learn. But there are, let's just take the New Testament, for instance. There are over 5,600 different manuscripts, that is, different copies of the New Testament. Now, when I say that, sometimes they can be a fragment about that big, okay, and it just have a few words scribbled on it. Sometimes it can be an entire book, okay, the whole book of Romans or the whole book of Revelation. Sometimes it can be what's known as a codex, and that codex will contain almost every book of the Bible. That codex is a bound volume, and it can contain almost every book of the Bible. Now, what has been done is individuals have gone and they've looked through all of those manuscripts, all of those copies, and they have, I'm using very broad general terminology, okay, to help us understand. And what they have done is they've looked through all those and they have tried to come up with one original document, okay, and we refer to that as a text. Okay, so you have what are referred to as Hebrew texts, and you have New Testament texts. All right, and there's several of them that have been made over the years. Okay, several Hebrew texts, several New Testament texts, and what has happened is the translators of our Bible, our English Bible, will go and they will find a Hebrew text and they will copy from that Hebrew text into the English language so that we'll have an English Old Testament. They'll go and they'll find a New Testament text and they'll translate from the New Testament text into English so that we'll have a New Testament. Okay, so all of our Bibles have been translated from either a Hebrew or a New Testament text. All right? Now, those texts are based upon the manuscripts, okay? And you can get very, very detailed in this, guys, okay? And you can get almost lost in it, and I don't want you to do that. I just want you to understand that our New Testaments have been translated from texts that have been made from various manuscripts of either the Old or New Testament. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, now I'll hand out these notes to you so that you can get lost even more. We're going to be looking at two things in this lesson. We're going to look at the Hebrew texts, and we're going to be looking at the New Testament texts. Okay? And I'll try to keep this just as simple as I can possibly keep it. When you're doing some reading about this particular subject, and you're reading about the Hebrew Old Testament, Okay, sometimes they just refer to it as the Hebrew Bible. There are other words by which the Hebrew Bible is known as well. Okay, one of them is known, and I've got it there in your notes. The second one, the Tanakh. Okay, Tanakh, the Tanakh. Okay, what they have, that is an acronym. The Hebrew Old Testament is divided into 3 different sections. Okay, and what they've done is they've taken letters out of the Hebrew language and have, like Torah, that's where the TA comes from, okay, the Torah. And so they've taken those letters and they formed a word out of it to refer to the entirety of the Bible, the Tanakh. Okay, I won't tell you all the Hebrew divisions and stuff, but one of them is the Torah, all right? And then there's another word by which the Hebrew Bible is known, and it is the, what does it say? Can you read it? Yes, the Mikra. And all that word means is, and I have it translated for you, that which is written. Okay, so when the Jews talked about that which is written, they weren't talking about government documents. They weren't talking about personal documents. What were they talking about? They were talking about Scripture, that which is written. Okay, that which is written. So that was one of the terms that they used in order to describe the Old Testament, the Mikra. So if you're ever reading and you're studying this particular subject and you read Hebrew Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, or Mikra, then it all refers to the 39 books of the Old Testament. Okay, that's what they're referring to. Notice point B. Between the 7th and 10th century, a Hebrew text was composed by a group of Jews known as the Masoretes or the Masoretes. Okay, that text came to be known as the Masoretic text. It was the received text of the Jews. Okay, it was the received text of the Jews. Some refer to it as the Rabbinical Bible. Okay, the Rabbinical Bible. It has been referred to as the majority text or the Textus Receptus. All right, so that is, just remember that there is a Textus Receptus, a Masorite text, the received text, the rabbinical text. All of those are a text of the Old Testament, okay, that you can go and get. If you want to buy it, you can. And if you wanted to do your own translation out of that text, you could. All right, just know that that's one of the texts. Notice the point number 2 down there. Okay, these are 2 more texts. There's 2 manuscripts are responsible for most of the Hebrew text that exists today, though. All right? I've got them classified under 2 of the codexes. All right? There's a codex called the Leningrad Codex. Now, what's a codex? I'm trying to keep it simple, but it's hard. Okay? What's a codex? Okay, a codex is a book. All right? A codex is a book. When we're talking about this codex, we're talking about a book that is a manuscript of the Hebrew Old Testament. Okay? It's a codex, and it contains all the books of the Old Testament. It's called the Leningrad Codex. The reason it's called that is because it is housed in Leningrad. Where is that? Russia. Folks, Leningrad no longer exists. Well, it does, but under a different name. What is it? St. Petersburg. Yes, St. Petersburg. It's been changed, okay? But it still has the library there, and this codex is housed there. And there have been many Hebrew texts that have been translated from the Leningrad Codex. Okay, now remember, a codex is one of what they consider one of the copies. Okay, and so they've taken that codex and it's become the basis. They've used other material as well, but it was the primary thing that was used to come up with a Hebrew text. And several of them have been done, and I've given you the names of them there. The Biblical Hebraica from 1937. Another Biblical Hebraica, that was just an updated version in 1977. The Dothan edition of the Hebrew Bible, and then what is known as the JPS Hebrew English Tanakh, and that one came out in 1999. So they're constantly updating these Hebrew texts, okay, from which translations are made, okay? Yes, it's a book. Okay, it's a book, a codex. What they've done is they've taken the parchments, the vellum, the papyrus, okay, of the books, and they just stacked them all together like a book, drilled holes through them, and bound them together so it looks like a what? So it looks like a book. That's a codex, okay? And so that one is several different copies of the Old Testament books that have been bound together in a single volume, and then they take that and they've translated it, and they've made a clean, good Hebrew copy out of that codex, okay? And so that one Hebrew text reads almost identical, okay? Whereas if you pick up the codex, different books are going to read in different ways because they're copies of the books from times past. Does that make sense? Okay, Jim?
They're not translated. This is still in
Hebrew to Hebrew, yes.
How would they change? New findings of old?
New findings, yes. Yeah, if they find new findings, if you have a group of individuals, and you'll see this a lot, they approach the Scripture from a different angle, from a different perspective. When we get into the New Testament, there was a man who he looked at the Greek text, the majority text, the received text, and he couldn't stand it, okay? He hated it. And so he approached that text from a whole different angle, from a non-inspirational angle, and came up with his translation, his text of the of the Greek New Testament. So a lot of different factors are involved in why they do it. Sometimes it's just a different group of men get together, and maybe they're going to translate for another country that doesn't even have a Bible yet. And so the first thing they'll do is, rather than just come up with a translation from another text, they'll first make the text. Okay, Westcott and Horton did that. Okay, they just came up with a totally brand new Greek text, even though a Greek text had already existed, because they did not like the authorized version. They didn't like the King James Version, and so they wanted to make a brand new text from which to translate, and they did. And that text is still around today and has hung on pretty well. Notice the next one. It's called the Aleppo text. Change that word text, put codex there, I'm sorry. It's the Aleppo Codex. This is another book that is, a lot of copies of the Old Testament scriptures. And this one is another volume that is used in order to make Hebrew Old Testament texts. And I've given you this is the main one that the Jews rely upon today for their Bible. It's housed in Aleppo, Syria. And notice on point H there, or it was housed in Aleppo, Syria. That's where it got its name. It's now in Israel, in the Israel Museum. And I've given you 4 different texts that they have translated from the Aleppo Codex. So you've got at least 8 Hebrew texts from just those 2 codex. Okay? So here's the deal. If you're going to make a translation, what's the first thing you're going to do? I'm going to find a text that I'm going to translate. Okay? Question. Can the text be very important? Yeah. Because these texts, they don't vary much, but there are variations between the texts, folks. And remember I said last week, you can only translate what is in the text. Is that true? Okay, if a word's not in the text, if a verse is not in the text, then you can't translate that. So, see, the reason I want to know that is this. I want to know which text is the best, right? Secondly, I want to know which text my translators of my version that I'm using translated from, because that tells me a lot about my translation. Okay, now, the unfortunate thing is you and I have to rely on many individuals by faith, don't we? Because we're not well trained in Hebrew and Greek, and so it makes it very difficult for us. But just knowing that these kind of things exist is important, all right? Guys, the Old Testament texts, especially since the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is not one that is questioned and is not one that has just a ton of criticism about it, okay? The numerous texts that are out there, they're almost in unison one with another. There's very few variations within them, and so it's not something that we have to worry about as much today, especially since the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Greek texts, on the other hand, are a little bit different, okay? And it's a little bit surprising. How many copies do we have? How many of the manuscripts? Over 5,600, okay? Now here's what I would like, okay? This is my preference. I would love for somebody to gather all those 5,600 manuscripts and get a team together, a committee, a group together, and really be honest and just use all 5,600 manuscripts and produce one Greek text. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Okay? That way, everybody would be standing on exactly the same authority, right? Well, that's not what happens, okay? I'm going all the way to the conclusion real fast. Don't look at the conclusion, okay? The New Testament was written when? First century, okay? Written in Greek, right? Okay, now guys, the first Greek text, official Greek text, okay, didn't come along until the 1500s. Isn't that interesting? So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what were they using before that? Does anybody know? Now remember, Greek copies, Greek manuscripts, they existed, but they didn't have a formal Greek text that was used until the 1500s. So what were they using from 100 till 1500? Anybody have a clue? It's really around 300.
Copies of letters that each congregation had.
No. Remember, the church has collected a lot of those Greek letters and epistles and stuff that have been written, okay? And folks, what church came along eventually by the 300s? The Roman Catholic Church came around, okay? Who do they pattern themselves after? They patterned themselves after Rome, okay? What language did Rome use predominantly? Much. They used the Latin language, okay? In the 300s, a man by the name of Jerome sat down and he had manuscripts available to him, okay? And he came up with a translation known as the Latin Vulgate. Anybody heard of that one? The Latin Vulgate. And folks, that translation of the Scripture was the official translation of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was the primary religion from 315 AD until the 1500s. Is that right? And so nobody even questioned what translation that we're using, okay? They never even thought about what translation is being used, all right? And so, nobody concerned themselves about Greek text. Nobody concerned themselves about Hebrew text. We have the Latin Vulgate here. This is the Bible. It was the Bible of the church. And most services were done in Latin, whether you understood Latin or not, and nobody really even questioned the need for a Bible, guys, okay? But the 1500s rolled around and people start having a different mindset, don't they? Okay? Anybody know who was one of the main men responsible for this different mindset? Yeah, Martin Luther, who was a Roman Catholic priest, wasn't he? Okay? And he disagreed with many of the things that the Catholic Church was doing, and he wanted to reform the Catholic Church, and he wanted to put the Bible back into the hands of the people. Well, in order to do that well, you needed a Hebrew text and you needed a New Testament text, didn't you? In order to translate from. And so these Greek texts started popping up. Notice the very first point there. The first published edition of the Greek New Testament was issued in 1516 by a Dutch humanist monk named Erasmus. And sometimes his text is referred to as the Erasmus text. Okay, very popular text. Notice a couple of points about it. It was a hurried edition due to the publisher's demands. He used only a minimal amount of manuscripts. Okay, he didn't take the majority of the manuscripts in order to make his text, but he did finally make one, and his text has become known as the Textus Receptus, or received text of the New Testament. A little bit later, 1745 to 1812. Now notice that 1745 is after what? It's after 1611. What happened in 1611? King James Version. Okay, King James Version was based on whose text? Erasmus. Okay, Erasmus text, the majority text. And so it was after that that more text started being developed. Okay, and this next man named John Grisselbach, he developed a text. Now he had access to what is known as the Vatican Codex. Sometimes you'll read about it in your Bibles and it'll say it is one of the oldest two existing manuscripts, and they refer to it not as the Codex, they refer to it as the Codex Vaticanus, okay, as one of the oldest texts available to man today. Dates back to about the 4th century. He had that codex at his disposal, and he used it in order to develop his Greek text. Now what's interesting about Grisselbach is that in the footnotes and in the side notes, he noted the variant readings, okay, from the different manuscripts and things, okay. One manuscript says this, another manuscript says this, and this is the preferred reading that should be in the text, okay. And he'd give the notes and explanations as to some of the variants that were there. And he was the very first man in order to start that today. Do we have a lot of that in our Bibles today? Oh yes, you open it up, and maybe in between Mark 16 verse 8 and Mark 16 verse 9, there is a little space, and it'll say something like this. The oldest manuscripts do not have Mark 16, 9 through 20 in them. Okay, so that's an insertion by the publishers into the text to talk about some of the textual stuff that's going on. Most of us have no clue about that stuff, do we? I mean, it's put there, and we're not smart enough to be able to make any decisions about it. Okay, 1793, another man, Carl Lackman, came around. Okay, he issued 3 Greek texts. His text used a small number of, notice this, early manuscripts. Okay, in your mind, which would you rather use? Would you rather use an early manuscript, say 3rd or 4th century, or would you rather use a late manuscript, 12th, 13th century? Most people would say they would want to use an early manuscript. Okay, most say that the earlier the manuscript, the better. Okay, that may not be the truth, folks. Okay, may not be the truth. If a manuscript was corrupted early, an individual saw that it was corrupted and they set it aside, even though it dates to the 4th century, okay, and it's been lost for 500 or 600 years, nobody's even used it, nobody's even cared about it, is that manuscript necessarily better than one's found in the 7th or 8th century? No. It may be worse than one found in the 7th or 8th century. Okay? So just because it's earlier doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, but that was his rationale, and so he used many early manuscripts. But notice, this is the man I was talking about a while ago. His rules of critical evaluation adhered to the ascent of rationalism, taking a non-inspirational approach to textual criticism. So in other words, he didn't look at the Bible as what? Inspired of God. Okay? And so could that taint the translation? Let me tell you, folks, the views of an individual, even the views of a group of individuals, can taint what's translated, okay, and how it's translated. So it's very, very important to know that individual's views. Notice D. You hear of Westcott and Hort, Brooke Westcott and Fenton Hort. They despised the Authorized Version. Okay, folks, they did not like the King James Version at all. All right? And so they went to the authorities and they asked, hey, can we update and revise, watch this, the King James Version? They were given the authority to do that. Okay, so they're going to update the King James Version. Rather than doing that, guess what they did? They came up with a brand new Greek text instead. Okay, now remember, the Erasmus text, the majority text, had been the primary text up to this point, right? And now Westcott and Hort, they hate that text. They hate that version. And so what they do is when they come out of their committee, they have a brand new Greek text that they have devised. Okay? And it's quite different from the other Greek text, right? And it has become the primary text from which most modern versions are translated today. Okay, now I have to say that with some reservations. It's been updated by others, but it is the text that many of the versions translate today. Okay, so and when we get into the versions a little bit, you'll see how it's affected the versions. Okay, notice that last point. They completely broke with the Textus Receptus, that is the King James Version and its text. Notice this next man, John Burgeon. You can buy a book from John Burgeon known as the Revision Revised, and John Burgeon despised what Westcott and Hort did. He hated it. Okay? And his Revision Revised is a fight against Westcott and Hort, and he shows them to be very vile, corrupt figures in their translation of this new text. Okay? And I'm thankful John Burgeon came along myself, okay, because he at least threw some light on what was going on back then. But that's the reason he's mentioned. He didn't produce a Greek text, but he did fight against Westcott and Hort. John Burgeon, and I mentioned this to you not long ago, John Burgeon is the man who has cataloged all of the quotes from the Old Testament by the and the New Testament by the church fathers, folks. I think it's like 18,000 quotes or something that he's documented, okay? And that has never been released to the public, okay? That document has never been released to the public. That's a shame, okay? Because it'd be nice to read those 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century writers who quoted from Old and New Testament so that we could compare them with the Old and New Testament today, wouldn't it? Okay, they just never been. He cataloged them. I mean, you can go find them, but you'd have to read all the church fathers, and let me tell you something, that'd be a booger bear, okay, to read them all. This next man, Eberhard Nestle and Erwin Nestle, that was his son, they attempted to harmonize all Greek texts into one critical edition. But notice, they sided with Westcott and Hort in the idea that the oldest manuscripts were always the best. Okay? So you can go get a Nestle's text today. Okay, you can go buy a Nestle's text. It's really been updated to include the next man, who is Kirk Arland. Okay, you really get a Nestle's Arland Greek text if you go out today. You can go to a library, or you can go on Amazon and you can buy one of these kind of texts. But what they wanted to do is do their best to just come up with one critical text of the New Testament. Okay, so that was their desire. Okay, his son worked to produce a very scholarly text. They finally came up with one with the help of Kirk Arland, and it was an updated version from the 1950s. And in 1979, they came up with the Nestle-Aland Novum New Testamentum Gracia. So that's their Greek text. Kirk Arland. Let me talk about him very quickly, okay? He's known as the scholar of all manuscripts. This man, he did what I would like to see other people do. He knew hundreds of manuscripts were out there, and he did everything he could do to get all those manuscripts into one central location, okay? And he worked himself to death. His wife was just about as sharp as he was when it came to those manuscripts of the New Testament. They finally came up with what is known as the Institute for New Testament Textual Research. Okay, I don't know exactly the number of manuscripts they've collected, but guys, it's a huge, huge amount of those manuscripts. Okay, the variants were noted. He included the patristic evidence as much as he possibly could. That's the church fathers. It's all been digitalized, meaning that it's on computer. Okay, and you can, if you want to, go into the computer now and pull up a lot of the stuff that Arlen has done his research. He's just unbelievable. He and his wife, Barbara, they had criteria for textual criticism. And I want you to just look at one or two of these statements down here. Only one reading can be original, however many variant readings there may be. Is that true? Debbie says yes. Anybody else? Notice what it says. Only one reading can be original. Is that true? Folks, when Paul wrote his letter, he only wrote it what? One way. Okay? Only one reading can be original. Okay, now there may be some variations, right? Take, for instance, I might say something like this. John and Jane went to the store. And then I find another one that says, Jane and John went to the store. The only difference is what? Change of the names. But you see, when it was originally written by the original author, it could only be one way, right? It either had to be John and Jane or it had to be Jane and John. Couldn't be both ways, right? So only one original reading can be original. Notice the next one. Only the reading which best satisfies the requirements of both external and internal criteria can be the original. You see, all he's doing is developing good rules for textual criticism. Okay? I want to get all the external evidence, and I want to get all the internal evidence before I do what? Before I make a decision on what was the original rendering. Okay? Criticism of the text must always begin with the evidence of manuscript tradition, and only afterward turn into a consideration of internal criteria. Okay? So he's just developing rules by which to formulate a Greek or Hebrew text. And folks, when you read through his rules and you really come to an understanding of his rules, guess what? He is on the money for the most part. Okay, he is on the money. Flip very quickly to the next page. Just let me show you something. Bruce Metker. This is one of the newest Greek New Testaments that have come out, was produced by these individuals. Okay, what we have now are called Bible societies, like the International Bible Society, and they publish Greek texts now. Okay, they, like Jim said, they'll find new evidence, they'll find more discoveries of different things, and so they want new texts that show all these updated versions. Well, this man was up until 2007 very heavily involved in these translations of all these new Greek texts. Notice point number 3. He wrote a textual commentary of the Greek New Testament to explain verse by verse for reasons for the textual decisions of the committee's 2,000 variants. Okay, so they came out with a Greek text. It had 2,000 variants, like names, spellings, different things like that, and all 2,000 differences. He came up with a book that explained every decision and why they made the decision and what they believed the original to be. You talk about work, that's work, folks. But he was a scholar in the Greek New Testament. So that gives you just a little bit of information. It's tough, isn't it? This is not easy stuff right here. It drives me crazy, okay, just trying to boil it down and give it to you. But thank y'all for listening to it anyway. We're going to be talking about the old manuscripts next week, the Vaticanus and the Sciaticus, okay, and those are the one that all the new versions are based upon, okay. No, they're not, they're just texts. Thank you.